Hello and welcome once again to Strategies for Living with author and international speaker Doug Sparks. In this episode, Doug will be discussing the roots of postmodernism and the Frankfurt School. And now, here's Doug.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us again. Today we're going to be talking about the Frankfurt School, but before we get into that, I'd like to circle back because remember I said that no philosopher just is sitting in his ivory tower trying to think up ideas. Usually it's occasional. So there's something going on in the culture and he's trying to figure out what's going on and what would be a possible solution. So I don't want to vilify Marxism as such because in the time of Marx, so he was doing his writing between, let's say, 1860 to 1870, somewhere along that. Das Kapital came out. I think actually it came out in 3 volumes. He was alive for the first volume, and the second 2 he'd already died. So Marx was looking back at what had just happened, particularly in British culture. But when you had the Industrial Revolution, which came along, let's say roughly from the late 1700s up until the 1850s or so, it was a massive change in the culture. Because now, with mass production and mass consumption and all this, the Industrial Revolution created 2 distinct categories, 2 classes, if you will. And Marx saw this as being a huge problem in the sense that you had the very, very wealthy, the business owners, and then you had the laborers, the workers. And if you go back and read the history of this time, I mean, it was, if you were a laborer, your life was miserable. As a matter of fact, it got so bad that in the last part of the Industrial Revolution, alcoholism was almost rampant among, almost 100% among the laborers. And bars actually set up little stairs where kids could come in and climb up the stairs and put their penny down and get a penny gin. So you started your alcoholism really early because life was really tough, really bad. And there was really no hope. And so Marx is looking at this and he's seeing the workers and he's seeing the bourgeois, the owners, and the disparity. And so, and rightfully so, the idea of capitalism where you have the producers and the laborers, the people that make it, and then you've got the owners, and in many cases the owners are taking unfair advantage of the workers. Now that has changed a little bit from the 1850s, but in some cases not so much. So I think, Marx had a legitimate observation. He made a legitimate claim that the disparity between the bourgeois and the proletariat was such that something needed to be done. And obviously there are people out there who obviously know more than I do about it. I'm not sure that Marx actually intended, I've read places where his intent was not to have revolution. Because if you know anything about Marxism, and I know very little, but I know a teeny little bit, that technically Marxism is called dialectical materialism. And so dialecticalism, if you can use that word, was a Hegelian, George Friedrich Hegel was a German philosopher, and he came up with the idea that you have this thing called dialecticism, which is a way that you could possibly move history or culture faster if you could set up this dialecticism, which is a 3-phased movement. So you have something that is what they call the thesis, let's say the standard, and then you have the antithesis, something that opposes it, and if you can cause those 2 to collide through revolution, then you come up with a synthesis. And then obviously that will morph into the next thesis. You have something that comes along that opposes it, and if you speed that up through revolution, you can move culture and society forward at a faster rate. And so that's kind of the idea. Now, some people argue that he never had in mind the revolution that, say, took place in Russia, for example, or that took place in China, or that took place in Cuba, or the problem is, I guess, would be all of these guys who were the practitioners of Marxism used exactly the same methodology. So whether his intent of that was explicit or not, the consequences of it have been this sort of totalitarian movement that never really was able to release the labor types to be free. It never happened. It didn't happen in Russia, it didn't happen in China, it didn't happen in Cuba. It hasn't happened yet. So all that to say that was sort of the foundation. Now, between Marx and when he wrote that and the postmodern era, let's say the 1950s and 60s and 70s along there when postmodernism was being created, there was one other school of philosophy that came along. It was called the Frankfurt School. Now, in 1923, a group of Jewish intellectuals met together at the University of Frankfurt campus, and they weren't all philosophers. They came from different backgrounds. One was a psychoanalyst, one was in economics, one was in philosophy. They came from different disciplines, but they saw what was going on in Russia at the time, shortly after Lenin took over, and they were looking back at Marxism, and they were saying, something isn't quite right here. We need to revisit Marxism, but not from the two classes that Marx saw, the bourgeois and the proletariat, the owners and the workers, the laborers. It needs to be more than that. And so rather than saying, that wasn't a good idea, they said, let's double down on this, and instead of having just two classes, let's break it down into much smaller segments of society. And so let's try to figure out how we can engage if the goal, and the goal was in Marxism to break down the old hierarchies in order for Marxism to come forth. And that was one of the criticisms they had actually of Russia, was that Lenin didn't take enough time to actually break down the old hierarchies that had ruled in Russia, and he just immediately tried to impose, obviously through revolution, but he tried to do it too quickly, and it went off the rails as far as some Marxists think. Now, the Frankfurt School, what they said was, no, we've got to break this down into smaller categories. So within a culture, what are the hierarchies in there that we need to destroy before real Marxism and utopia could come along? Well, they started looking at things like racialism, okay? Race is one of the considerations that you have. Another consideration would be gender. Another consideration would be what's left of religion, social philosophy. One of the big ones is language. And just as an aside here, during that same time in the mid-1920s, there was an interesting philosopher. His name was Ludwig Wittgenstein. He was Austrian, came from one of the wealthiest families in Europe. At one time, his father was one of the richest three men in the world. And it was under Wittgenstein that he had this idea that when you went to critique text, it wasn't so much what the author of the text wrote that was important, it was the person that read it. And so it was what I read in the text is what the text really means, not necessarily what the author intended. And there are infinite ways that you can interpret any text. Okay, so that looks like a little bit of an aside, but that's going to weave its way back into the story a little later on as well. So you had the Frankfurt School, and then you had Wittgenstein all coming along in the mid-20s. Now, again, it took about 30 or 40 years before this to work its way in. Now, if you are a philosopher and you were in the academic world, you knew well and good and well what the Frankfurt School was all about. But the thing that makes them important is this: at the end of their time, they finally came up with which is called the critical theory. Okay, so this is where we get the critical theory idea. So if you take gender, you take race, you take economics, you take all these subgroups, hierarchies of those, you've got to destroy those in order for Marxism, the idea of Marxism, to be able to penetrate capitalism. You've got to destroy these hierarchies first, otherwise it's not going to work. Now here's what's happened, which was quite interesting. From 1923, say to 1929, and as I mentioned, all these intellectuals and philosophers were Jewish. And so obviously being in Germany as the 30s came out was not a good place to be. And so they left, I think in 1929, they left and came to the United States. And I think they were in the States about 14 years. I think they returned back to Germany after the war in 1949. But when they lived in the United States, unfortunately, I think they most ended up in California. Okay. Now, if they had ended up in Minnesota or somewhere, they might not have. It may not have had a different reaction. But they end up in California. Now, you got to understand, these guys are old school. And I lived in Europe for 20 years, and most Americans don't understand that. I don't know. There's a sense in Europe of their culture, their language is ancient. I mean, it's old. Over there, if you have a house that's 500 years old, that's not so bad. Here, our oldest house might be 100 years old. I would think that's old. But for them, there's a deep-rooted sense of culture and tradition, and you have to respect that. And life is somber. Life is it's hard, and you've got to take it seriously. So they end up in Southern California, and they spent 14 years out there. And they're looking around and they see Hollywood and everybody's going to movies and they see people driving around in their convertibles and laying on the beaches and they're having fun and they see how prosperous they are. They've got new cars, they've got nice homes, they've got nice facilities. And for them, they are appalled. And the reason why is they're thinking these poor proletariat worker types have sold their soul to the capitalist system in order that they might have these little trinkets of pleasure. And so that's the insidiousness of capitalism, is we're going to give you guys just enough stuff so that you can amuse yourself and that you can, have fun and recreate and all that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, the strong hand of the proletariat or of the bourgeois is alive and well, because we're controlling all the wealth and we're just giving you the crumbs to live on, and you're blind enough not to see what's happening to you. And especially, I watched an interview of Herbert Marcuse, who was one of the original Frankfurt participants in 1923. So he's been with all the way along. And he was given an interview shortly before he died in 1973. And he was kind of recapping his life. And he was the one that was telling the story of how utterly appalled that they were when they lived in California to see all of the shallowness, the frivolity of what was going on. And nobody seemed to see the bigger issues. And he also was the one, and I was hoping, because I think the interviewer asked him at one point, well, not necessarily do you have any regrets, but looking back, are the things that you're disappointed? And I thought maybe he would have said something about, it's at least it's unfortunate that we know of all these, that Marxism went off the rails in Russia. He didn't say anything about that. But what he did say, two things. Well, he said the most important, or the one that caught my eye at least, was he said, we almost had revolution in America in the late 60s. He said it was fomenting to the point where he said, I thought it would actually break out into true revolution. But he said it never happened. And so we never got to see what could happen in the United States. It didn't take place. And so the Frankfurt School now has created this thing called the critical theory. And the reason I was curious about this, and and did some. Like I said, I don't make any claims to being the brightest bulb on the line by any stretch, but I've got this incredible sense of curiosity, and I'm a little bit of a contrarian. I mean, if everybody's going this way, I've got to go that way. You know, if everybody says I've got to go there, so I started hearing this thing, critical race theory, and I'm going, it didn't quite sound right, because usually when you have a critical theory, it's the broader strokes. It's the like the Frankfurt School came up with the critical theory of social reform, and so to have a critical race theory, that the race part maybe shouldn't be in there at this point, and so that's when I tracked it back to the Frankfurt School and come to find out that what they came up with was the critical theory of how you go about tearing down these hierarchies. And so the hierarchy of race, I guess you would call it now race is a construct, which is a part of the hierarchy. It can be torn down. And so the Frankfurt School then plays into what we're going to discuss next, and that is the three French philosophers who are credited for the kind of amalgamation of postmodernity and postmodern thinking. So they each had a little different input. I'm not going to, just for the sake of time and hopefully a little bit of clarity, I'm going to commingle them all together and give you kind of the highlights of what was going on. So again, I can't stress enough how disappointed and how much true despair there was in the philosophical community from, say, the 50s through maybe the 70s. I'm just guessing there, but during that period of time. Because basically what these three French philosophers, and they are Jacques Derrida, there is Jean-Francois Lyotard, and there was Michel Foucault. So those three guys are the ones that kind of put together the postmodern philosophy. Now, they were contemporaries, they were friends, at least Foucault and Derrida were for a while. They had a falling out later on, but they were collaborators. They worked together in collaboration. It's not a conspiracy, but it is a collaboration of their thinking and their workings. And I think what the way it came about was they looked back over, say, the last 2,000 years, and they say, you know what? Nothing has really changed. Nothing has really happened. It's still the same old problem over and over again. We're just recycling through, and we've just recycled through another era, and something drastically has to change. And so what they decided was this, that as looking back over what were the problems, rather than repudiating all the other philosophies, they decided to double down and move forward into an era that is uncharted waters. We've never been in these waters before. And this is, my contention, is where the philosophical tectonic plate shifted from, say, 1945 to 1960, and it set off the tsunami that we're feeling, that we're dealing with in our culture today. And so they were so disgusted with the past and say, okay, we're going to double down and we're going to move forward, and we are taking no prisoners. We're not being held back by anything. We are going to create something that is entirely new. And so as they began to look and talk and investigate what went wrong in the past, the number one thing that they kind of came up with in terms of agreement was this. If you look over the past, the thing that caused the greatest confusion, the thing that caused the greatest retardation, shall we say, of man moving forward was because man had what is called a meta-narrative, or a grand narrative, or an overarching story to their culture. And this overarching story within it had a number of hierarchies. And under these hierarchies are what kept this meta-narrative afloat. And so and hierarchies always do two things. They go corrupt at the top and they disenfranchise at the bottom. Doesn't matter what the hierarchy is, it's going to do that. And so in order then to create a new social order, we have got to destroy the idea of the meta-narrative, because that's what's holding these cultures together. And so a meta-narrative might be, for example, the narrative of democracy, okay, or the narrative of religion, or the narrative that is over a culture in terms of financial hierarchies and how the finances are created and used in a culture. And so in order to do that, we are going to have to make an assumption. Remember, Aldous Huxley, I made an assumption. Doesn't mean it's right. It just means it's an assumption. So their assumption is this: there are no meta-narratives. There are no overarching stories of mankind at any level. Now you may say, what's the big deal with that? There's no story. That's not revolutionary. Oh, yes, it is. And here's the reason why. Now, again, full disclosure, I am a evolutionary theist. Okay, so I believe in evolution. I also believe that there's God. So for now, we're going to set the God part aside for a while. We're going to get to that later on in the episode when we talk about the nature of spirituality. I'm going to leave that aside for now. Let's talk evolution. Been around on the earth, somewhere around at least microorganisms from 3 billion years on. So we've had quite a long history of evolving. Man, as we kind of know him, as far as we know, somewhere around 200,000 years. And I've read articles recently where they found some stuff that maybe goes 500,000 years back. But we'll be conservative and say, okay, 200,000 years, man has evolved. And we've formed very complex capabilities, particularly in the mind and the brain, the way the brain functions, the way we have the different systems of controlling emotion and thought and consciousness and all these kinds of things. And by the way, let me just put in a plug here for Andrew Huberman. If you want to know everything there is to know about neurobiology and the latest research that's going on, you've got to listen to the Huberman Lab. That's Huberman. Huberman, Andrew Huberman Lab. Now, he is a professor of ophthalmology and neuroscience at Stanford. He also runs a research lab. And he has a podcast that comes out, I think, every week. And he takes, and he's one of these brilliant guys that is able to, obviously, to work in the very complex world of neuroscience, but at the same time, he can come out and in layman terms tell you what's going on. So the fun part is he's telling, and then he has a lot of his buddies who also are running labs around the country at places like Harvard and Johns Hopkins and some of these very, very famous institutions, and they're saying, hey, here's the research that's coming out. So what you're getting is the freshest research that's being done, that is being done now. You're getting it in real time. And most of the times, if their research is published, it's in some arcane magazine or paper and in a medical journal, and it doesn't reach the public for maybe 3 to 5 years. And then the worst thing that can happen is when the media gets a hold of it and they spin it for their own uses. But with Huberman Lab, you get it all right up front. So don't take my word for all this. Listen to Andrew Huberman. He's the expert, and he'll get you well informed and well educated on this. But anyway, we're talking about 2,000 years of evolutionary thought and progress that comes along. And then all of a sudden, you have somebody that automatically wants to flip this all on its head. And from the very beginning, I think you got to be cautious when you don't have a plan for where this is going to go. And when in postmodernity, they're talking about this, the nature of, there's no meta-narrative. That sounds good, but what that means is this: because of our human evolution, the only way our brain has to make sense of anything is by story. If you don't have story, then you don't have any context, and without context, you have no meaning. So instead of saying, hey, the world has no meaning, they don't do that. They say, no, there's no overarching story. So if there's no story, there's no context, then there's no meaning. For example, if you walk up and I'm talking to a person and you hear me say, I hate my father. And that's all you heard. Now you haven't heard the story, this mini story that my friend and I are telling each other. And you walk up and all you hear is, I hate my father. You know what I said. What you don't know is, what do I mean? Do I mean I hate my father? Or do I mean, if you knew the context of the story, my friend and I were talking about a mutual friend who had come to me to try to get some counseling and advice. And at one point I asked him, well, what's your biggest problem? And he said, I hate my father. So what I am is I'm quoting this guy, but you don't know that. All you know is what you heard me say. So you have no idea what the meaning is. And so when you tear away meta-narrative, there's no context. There's nothing to be a context of. And therefore, you can't make of any meaning out of it. But then we bring our buddy Wittgenstein in, who said, hey, guess what? There's infinite ways that you can interpret text. There's also no infinite ways you can now interpret story. If you break it down, then there's no meta-narrative, but there's mini stories, little stories, tiny ones, your personal story. And the only story that counts is your story, because there's infinite ways of interpreting any story. And your way, it's not better or worse than anybody else, but for you, it's your true story. Now, what that does then is set up a cascade of movement into our culture that begin with the breaking down of our society and breaking down of our social constructs. And I just want to read. This is an idea that came out of the Frankfurt School. And so it says this. It says, the critical theory came to fruition with the goal of destroying whatever it perceived to be the old ways of thinking, modernity. This is going to be important. So the critical theory is set up to be able to destroy the old way of thinking. So all of modernity has to be not simply tweaked or reformed, it has to be destroyed. And so in our next session, we're going to be talking about the deconstruction of every social construct and how it works and what are some of the examples that we're experiencing today. Thanks a lot. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. Join us next time on Strategies for Living with Doug Sparks.